Hey, what's up, barbecue lovers? We're here with Marco Aguilar at Aguilar Meat Market today. Marco, what's going on, brother?
How's it going, Arnie? Pretty good, man.
We're going to talk about beef ribs today. Marco, why don't you tell us a little bit about the beef ribs, where they come from, which cut is what. My thing is the big beef rib. Everybody talks about the big beef rib, especially here in Texas. But I know there's a 4-bone rib and a 3-bone rib, so break them down for us. Tell us where they come from.
Today we have an export rib, which is your bone and ribeye. Under it is your back rib, finger rib. We got your 4-bone chuck short rib. We got your monster rib, your 1, 2, 3, 8 loaded rib. You got the bones here on the back of it.
Big old bone.
You got your loaded rib ready cut. Your top short rib cut as well. The chuck short rib cut. And then we also have our Naval Plate, which produces your brisket end. And those are the cuts of beef we got today. Okay, Arnie, so basically what we have here is all your basic beef cuts as far as the different types of beef ribs. They're mostly broken down here into primals, but that's how they're laid out on the forequarter of the actual steer itself. So most people recognize this as a prime rib roast, which actually has your ribeye, of course. There's your chuck end of your ribeye and your strip loin of your ribeye. But what people don't realize is that the bottom of it is actually your beef finger rib. So
My favorite rib.
yeah. So your finger rib gets peeled off of your ribeye, and that actually produces your finger rib, and that's why a lot of people say it has a lot of flavor. It has a lot of good texture to it because it's basically coming off of one of the best parts of the actual steer itself.
So the finger rib is the bottom part of the ribeye. Wow.
Yeah.
I've always wondered why nobody leaves like a big old piece of or a meat cap here. But correct me if I'm wrong. But I've always thought it's because you can get more money for the ribeye than the rib. Right?
So a boneless ribeye is going to run you about $10 a pound, whereas a finger rib is going to run you at the most about $2-3 a pound. So at the same time, that's why a lot of the time the meat packers themselves, if you see finger ribs inside the counter or you see them at H-E-B or Walmart or any other meat markets, a lot of them come notched.
Yes, I've seen that.
People end up seeing ventanas. They have a lot of windows in them.
Right.
And that's because people are trying to leave more of the meat. The packers are trying to leave more of the meat on the primal because you're obviously going to get more money for the primal.
Right. That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense.
So a lot of people say that a lot of people call the English rib the 3-bone rib, but to me the English rib is the chuck short rib, the 4-bone rib. And the chuck short rib comes actually under the shoulder and right above the chuck. And the reason I call it the English rib.
So this would be the chuck end on this side?
Yeah, this is the chuck end, right? And the reason I call it the English rib is because there's actually an English steak that goes part of the shoulder clot and with the English rib. And that 4-bone is what comes on that English steak. So this is the 4-bone chuck short rib, and this is actually the whole one of the chuck short rib also. A lot of people say that this is the dinosaur rib. To me, the dinosaur rib is actually the 123A because the 123A is a lot thicker, as you can see, than the chuck short rib is. The 123A comes a little bit further down on the carcass.
When you say down, you mean lower in the animal?
Yeah, lower, towards the further down the breastplate.
Okay.
And so it's you start with the shoulder, then you get to the actual primal, the prime rib. Below the prime rib becomes your 123A loaded rib. There's also what's called the 123B. The 123B just means that extra rib's still on there, the 4th bone. Mm-hmm. The 123A produces your loaded ribs, which a lot of people call this the English rib. And like I said, it has a lot more meat on it than the chuck short rib does. And it also produces your top short rib.
So that would be the short rib?
Yeah, this is the short rib.
So the short rib actually comes from the big 3-bone?
Yeah, what they like to call the short rib is, they'll call them either flanking ribs or short ribs. Short ribs are when you cut with the bone. Flanking ribs are when you cut across the bone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's one of my favorite ribs ever is the short rib, but I always thought it came from the 4-bone, but see, even I learned something today. It actually comes from the 3-bone, big rib.
Yeah.
This is what most of your barbecue restaurants cook and call the monster rib.
The dinosaur
right?
rib, yeah.
The
Yeah,
dinosaur
the
or monster rib, yes.
Yeah, so this is what most of them use. It's thicker, and a lot of people will say, no, well, I got dinosaur ribs, but they were real thin, or they weren't real thick, or, well, a lot of people are getting the chuck short rib as a dinosaur, which is the 4-bone. You gotta ask for the 3-bone. And
you
on
gotta
top
ask
of that,
for the 3-bone, okay.
it also depends on the size of the cattle. If you have, beef further down from South Texas, it's good beef, but the cattle's smaller. Mm-hmm. If you get beef from, I believe this one's from Nebraska, if I'm right. If you get beef from Nebraska, Iowa, larger beef, then it gets a lot thicker in
No
size.
kidding. So their animals are bigger up north.
Yeah, they feed out a little bit longer, and it just produces larger beef and larger bones and stuff like that.
Interesting.
The last one we got is the Naval Plate. The Naval Plate is actually what they call the brisket end, and the reason they call it the brisket end is because your brisket is on your breastplate and it runs into your navel plate. So your navel plate produces your brisket ends, which this would be a brisket end that's cut up. And I like to call those fire starters because of how much fat they have on them.
That makes sense. Fire starters because they got a lot of fat.
Yeah, they start dripping on the. Yeah. They start dripping on your fire, and right away you'll get a flame up.
Yeah, and they also add some wonderful flavor too. I call that it atomizes into the air of the barbecue pit, and it flavors everything in there, and adds a really good taste to it. So this is what they call brisket bacon as well. Okay, right?
Yeah, and the reason they call that the brisket bacon is because that's basically this top part is what you would call the skin on belly on a pig, and that's actually your bacon that comes out on a pig as well.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this would be the bacon on a pig. Okay, I have a question that I was trying to think about earlier. If we were comparing a hog to a steer or a cow, which one of these ribs would be considered the baby back, and which one would be considered the spare rib?
Okay, so on a hog, the pork loin is going to run all the way from your chuck end to the end of your sirloin, which is it's a real long piece of rib. Okay. When you get to the middle of your baby back, right before you hit the tenderloin, which would end up being like your T-bone steaks, the back of it would be this part, and that would actually be your baby back. So
the finger rib would actually be the.
It's comparable to a baby back. The only difference is that a baby back, finger rib's only seven bones. A baby back's actually 14 bones.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you look at a baby back and a spare rib, if you ever have a chance to put them together, you put them side by side, and you can see where the spare rib starts and the baby back, and it lines up completely. And spare rib's also 14 bones. Okay. Baby back's also 14 bones. So that's exactly where they hit. So your spare rib would be basically kind of your dinosaur ribs and down here, and then your navel plate would be where the St. Louis ends and that breastbone on the spare rib begins. So that's why a lot of people can say that you can actually take a navel plate off of a carcass just with a knife, because it's just cartilage. The way you can separate a St. Louis rib between a spare rib to break that breastbone. So this navel plate is actually like the breastbone of the spare rib itself.
Okay. Interesting, very interesting. So now we know why finger ribs are my favorite, because they're actually considered or comparable to a baby back on a hog. Now I know why I like them so much, because they're just full of flavor. I just wish they had more meat. Maybe if we paid the right price, you'd cut this in half and leave the meat on the bone.
Look like a butterflied primal, and that's what a true. Not a lot of people do it, but a true country style pork rib is a pork loin, usually the chuck end of the pork loin, and what they do is they leave almost the majority of the meat on the pork loin, and they cut in between the bones, so it's like a back rib, but with actual meat still on it.
Interesting. Yeah. So then I think what we would probably have to do is buy the whole
and you can do
roll with the bone-in prime rib roll, and then just cut it wherever we want, and then we'll have some mini steaks too, right?
Yeah.
Because you won't be able to use the whole ribeye then.
Yeah.
You're going to have half ribeyes, right, if we leave the meat on the bone. So we're just going to have to buy the whole thing one of these days, and maybe next New Year's we can afford to do that. I'm thinking that would be a pretty expensive cut of meat.
The whole primal, we'll sell it by the bone as well, but the whole primal we sell it for $9.89 a pound. I think that's what we were doing this last holidays. And we usually use a bigger primal, so if it's boneless, it's separated by 13.5 up and 13.5 down. If it's bone in, you're looking somewhere around 17 to 20 pounds on the ones that we use on the bone in primals.
Now this I noticed has a lot of marbling. That comes from the big giant rib. They call it the monster rib. Of course, we know fat's flavor, so that makes a really good, tasty rib. I always think these kind of have sort of a brisket taste to them. Are they close to the brisket, or is it just because they have a lot of marbling?
They're comparatively close. So this is one of the first ribs that you'll cut, and it comes out actually right next to the breastplate. It's on the 1, 2, 3A rib. So it's right on top of the navel, right where the breastplate ends.
Okay. That's what makes them so good. These kind of like the brisket, you got to cook them at least 3 hours.
You get all the
Slow.
flavors break down.
Yeah, you need that collagen and the connective tissue to break down. But man, when they do, they're amazing, just wonderful. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the barbecue houses in Texas especially cook these monster ribs, because you cook them low and slow, cook them long enough, that collagen breaks down, and they just become so juicy, so succulent, so really, really wonderful. And so the chuck rib has a little different flavor than the three-bone rib. And I guess it's just one of them deals, because I noticed, like, you know, a ribeye doesn't taste like a sirloin, and they don't taste like fajita, either one of them. So every different cut, every different part of the cow, every different rib has a different flavor. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna buy 3 or 4 different ones, and then we're gonna go home, we're gonna cook them, and just kind of see how the different flavors are.
Yeah, that's good. Actually, the chuck rib is going to be comparable to, flavor-wise, to me, is an aguja. The
Aguja, yeah. Is that where the aguja comes from?
The bone and chuck roll, yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
you know, I had some of those in Mexico. The first time I ever had agujas, it was in Matamoros. I was talking to a business guy there, and I didn't know what it was. They served them in the restaurant. I was like, holy cow, that was a really good cut of meat, man. But we don't know them here.
Yeah,
now we do. Back then they did.
Yeah, our agujas are a little bit different than the ones in Mexico. The ones in Mexico actually look like needles. They only have the it's like a neck bone that runs across on the top, and you can really tell the difference why they actually call it agujas. And then so agujas are only produced as far as box beef wise by the Mexican beef producers, Su Carne, Carnica, Gusi, Fertes. And to my knowledge, the only one that I've been able to find that produces it over here in the States is Cane Beef, which is right up the street in Corpus. So I believe because they're so close to Mexico, that's why they actually produce it. But if I try to get it from Cargill or Swift or an IBP or something like that, I have a real hard time actually finding a bone-in chuck roll like that.
Just real quick, Marco, between Select, Choice, Prime, is there like a huge difference? Has anything changed in the last few years? I noticed that more and more people are buying Prime brisket. I know it's a little more expensive. I know we cook with them also, and you also carry some Snake River Farms and some Makashi sometimes, Wagyu stuff. So, I mean, is there like a bigger demand for Prime now than there used to be in the past, or?
I feel like people are a lot more knowledgeable now. People like yourself have been doing videos. I know that the big barbecue houses, Texas Monthly, got real famous on the top 50 and stuff like that. So people start to know a little bit more knowledge that, okay, Prime's better than Choice, and then there's also Upper 2/3 Choice, which is CAB, 1855, Republic Reserve, and that's a good product as well. And then, like you said, people try to go for Wagyu every once in a while, but then they get a little scared with the prices.
Yeah. You mentioned 1855. Tell us a little bit what that is. What is 1855? Just so people will be a little more educated on that. I know what it is because you explained it to me before, but I think a lot of people don't realize. They see it out there, they hear about it, but they don't really know what exactly the 1855 is.
So 1855 is a line of beef from Swift, and Swift is either the first or second biggest producer in the nation of beef. They kill something like 30,000 head of cattle a week. Yeah. So
all barbecue lovers, I think.
and they have a number of plants. I mean, and they have plants that only carry Angus. They have plants that only carry Holstein cattle. They have plants that only carry Hereford cattle. And the 1855 comes from the 969G plant, which is in Long Island, Nebraska. So it's consistent as to the marbling, it's consistent as to the size, it's consistent as to the texture of the beef. And it's also has a criteria that it needs to meet. And if you ever have a chance, the USDA has a spec sheet for all the lines of beef, like I said, 1855, CAB, Republic Reserve, all those. And the spec sheet on 1855 is one of the highest ratings that you'll be able to find. I believe it's moderate marbling and above. It's like 00 grade or something like that. And the actual ribeye circumference has to be, I think, 9, and the carcass weight has to be 1050. So you know it's big cattle. You know that it's not too old because it has to be less than 30 months as well, the cattle itself. And it just, the specs on it really helps produce a great product on the beef itself.
Wow, so there's all this criteria that makes it a better good cut of meat if you want to cook briskets that are 1855. Would you compare them to, say, the CAB upper choice, maybe?
The 1855 and CAB are identical on the spec sheet. The only difference is that CAB, it's a great line of beef, but National produces it, Swift produces it, IBP produces it, XL produces it, Demcoda produces it. So those are all big plants, and they're all big producers. It's just that you can find a good CAB. It's just I think it's going to be harder to find a consistent CAB compared to finding a consistent 1855.
So the 1855 has a possibility of being much more consistent because it all comes from one place.
It all comes from one plant.
Interesting. That's good to know.
Yeah, CAB, if you get it from Texas, it's going to be a good brisket, but it's going to be smaller. If you get it from Nebraska or Iowa, it's going to be a huge brisket. And then the 1855s, there is some variation in weight, but you're never going to find anything under 10 pounds. And a CAB, every once in a while, you'll find something under 10 pounds. And the 1855, you're never going to find anything above 18 pounds. And the CAB, sometimes you'll find a monster 22-pounder every once in a while. Yeah.
All right, Marco, we're going to wrap this up. I got to ask you this question. If you personally, being a meat market guy, what is your favorite rib to eat? Beef rib.
That 1, 2, 3 rib, the one that you call the monster rib.
Yeah.
That's my favorite one. But I like to cook it whole. And the way I like to do it also is, and you can ask any butcher to do this as long as they have a saw in the plant. I like to break the bone, to just break it the way the top short rib's kind of broken. Okay. Yeah. So you break the bone, and then you cook it whole. So that way the meat's still intact and it stays juicy. But at the same time, when you're ready to serve, you're not going to get monster ribs for even the kids or something like that. You're going to get 6 individual ribs. Or you can even break it into thirds as well and get 9 individual ribs.
Interesting. When I was a kid, my grandpa used to live right here on Mall and 21st Street, and they used to cook a lot of these short ribs. Back in those days, it was like a cheap cut. Way back, I still remember, man. I smell the grease in my head right now, and the flavor. Back then, of course, it was just salt and pepper. And I still, when I was a kid, I remember, man, they were just an amazing cut of beef rib, and I still love them today. I like to cut them 3 ways here, which I guess is kind of the same thing. It winds up being a short rib, but I didn't know that they came from the monster rib. I always thought it was a chuck rib. Now I know why I like them so much, because they're coming from the monster rib, and you see all that beautiful marbling, a lot of good fat there that just tastes great when it cooks out. And on these, when you cut them, they're called down here, they're called tablitas, also loaded ribs. I like to cut them about 3/4 of an inch. This looks like it's about an inch, right?
Yeah, it's an inch.
That's about an inch. Anywhere from a half to an inch is my personal favorite. Some people like them real thin because they cook quicker, but I like them a little bit thicker because I can cook them a little bit longer and break that collagen down. And they just taste wonderful. Really good stuff, man. All right, that's going to wrap up the rib section explanation. I hope that you guys got a good explanation from Marco here. Marco, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, bro. Had a good time, and thank you for having us and explaining all this stuff. We dispelled some of the mystery of where the beef ribs come from.